Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Professor Nick Lane, I appreciate you joining me today.
Pleasure, thank you.
Yeah, Michael Levin connected us, and I'm very grateful for that. And I had him on the podcast, and I've had Carl Friston and Anil Seth, and a lot of really cool people that have been helping me to understand what life is and the nature of consciousness from different perspectives. And your name just kept coming up. And it's because I keep asking questions about mitochondria and about biology, and everybody goes, you got to get Nick Lane on. So I'm grateful to have you here because you've written 5 books and you seem to have some unique perspectives that are not typical when you start to talk to different people in the field of biology. And I'd love to explore consciousness with you today and start to hear a little bit about you. And a lot of people have probably never heard of you too. So I'd love to have you just do a little brief introduction as to what you're currently doing and who you are. And then we'll start diving in, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I am a biochemist by background. What I'm really interested in, though, is how energy works in biology. And there's a kind of a weird way that it works, which is to say cells have got an electrical charge on their membrane. For ourselves, it's not our cells do have a charge on the membrane, but really where energy flow is happening is in our mitochondria, which are often called the power packs inside cells. And they've got an electrical charge on the membrane in there, which is about 200 millivolts. But if you were to shrink yourself down to the size of a molecule, and kind of stand next to that membrane, what you'd experience would be 30 million volts per meter, which is like a bolt of lightning. So I guess I've spent about 30 years working in one way or another on mitochondria. I actually started out interested in organ transplantation in my PhD. It was to do with what's called ischemia reperfusion injury, which is to say you take an organ out, you put it on ice, maybe for a day or two, and then you transfer it back in again, you transplant it back in again. The problem is when you reintroduce oxygen, and that problem is down inside the mitochondria and how it deals with energy flow. So that was how I got into it all. As you noted, I've written some books as well, and those books are on kind of the big sweep of evolution and Earth history and going right back to the origin of life. And the more I've worked on those things, I guess you always bring your own prism to it, but the prism that I brought is how energy works, and it seems that all cells, all life on Earth uses this amazing electrical charge on membranes, and you're just left wondering, why is it that way? Why is it like that? It's not the way you'd think it would be organized. So I've got this very simplistic question underpinning everything, which is wondering how did it get to be that way?
It's amazing. Yeah, and it seems like Michael's work, Levin's work, he is actually using it in a practical application in his lab. And I'm curious, is there a bunch of people in the field of biology now, in your opinion, that have taken a lot of what you've discovered and started to apply it? Or is it still something where people are stuck in an old paradigm? Because it seems like it's a newer understanding of life, the way that you're thinking.
This understanding of electrical charge on membranes goes back to Peter Mitchell in the 1960s and Jennifer Moyle and people like that. So we've known about this for a long time, and we've known that nerves are electric, if you like, going back even earlier than that. So the idea of electrical charge mattering in biology is well known and goes back a long way. But I think it was, I guess, marginalized or dismissed as old knowledge in comparison to genetics. You know, we can sequence whole genomes and we can understand a tremendous amount from genomes. And it is easy now to sequence genomes. It took a lot of working up to that. And I think it's somewhat changed people's perception of what biology is. It's now perceived largely as a kind of an informational, computational science, and there's truth in that. But the old biology, if you like, how cells work, and the way that energy flow and metabolism works in cells, has almost been forgotten. So I guess all I'm doing is bringing it back and having a focus on that and asking how did it arise in the first place? And the more you think about how it arose in the first place, the more you realize that it wasn't invented by genes. This is something which effectively changes the way that genes work. So it's the structure of cells, it's the energy flow through cells, which is primary in biology.
Yeah, it seems like your writing is doing such a nice job of re-infusing the curiosity and the wonder and the really spark of why. And what I'm gathering too is that in school, a lot of times, if you were to go to study biology, people just memorize words and pick up on what we've already known. And then you move on and you're just trying to almost keep your head above water to keep going. And it's a lot about memorization now. And you just breeze over some of these complexities. And I've heard you even describe things like proteins and how complex they are. And then when you look at imagery or video that they can implement, and you're like, geez, this might be one of the most complex things I've ever seen in my life. And no one drills into that. When I was learning in school, no one blew my mind about these basic fundamentals. And it seems like you're doing that with your books. You're showing the awe and the wonder, which is amazing.
Well, that's very nice for you to say so. I mean, I suppose one thing that I think is that there's a big appetite out there for the edge of science, the edge of what we know, and the wonder about the universe. And it seems that a lot of people are willing to read books on quantum physics or string theory, cosmology, whatever it may be, and they read it not expecting to necessarily follow everything, but to have their mind blown by it. And I have the feeling, this is just my own perception, that people don't like being talked down to or patronized and actually are genuinely interested in how the hell do we know these things. It's no good just asserting that this is the way the world is. I think people get very irritated by that. But if instead you go into, well, here's a way of getting at this question, and here's what we can actually do in the lab and ask this question, and here's what the results are, and I don't know what to make of these results, what do you make of them? It's almost a conversation then, and that's how it ought to be. It's much more fun for everybody, and it kind of connects, I would say, people doing science who are people, primarily people with questions in their head, with people who aren't actively doing it, who have questions in their head, and they're kind of interested to know, well, what do we know about this? How did we, how did this assertion, how did this guy come here and assert this thing at me? On what basis does he say that? So, I think there's a lot to be said there, and I have a lot of fun in trying to say it, and it's nice that some people listen.
Yeah. Is there some people, when you started writing, was there people that made you have that desire to connect the general audience, the general public to these worlds? Because it seems that words are so important and language plays such a role in shaping even the future directions of science and how we think. And if you're inspiring the younger generation of scientists, it seems like your books are doing that. The younger kids are reading it, and I'm sure they're going, oh my God, this is amazing work. Gives them permission slips to go forward and to actually think science is fun too.
Yeah, I guess I kind of realised that there's an appetite for it. Partly there's a guy, a physicist in the UK called Brian Cox, and some of his TV series were amazingly popular. Millions of people watching them. And he was the thing that was really striking was that he was not dumbing it down. He was talking about conservation of angular momentum on he'd explain what he meant by it, but this was primetime TV, and it was really appreciated. So as I say, there is this appetite out there, but there's nobody doing it for biochemistry or even chemistry. And the reason for biochemistry, you've touched on it already, there's all these terms, and this is what's taught in school. You have to learn what a protein is, what a mitochondrion is, so much terminology that it drives you to the edge of despair, I think, for most people. So how much of that can you cut out? And the sad thing about biology is, these words describe things, and those things are what you see in a microscope or what you kind of infer the world is like. So that's part of the problem of writing about it, is how do you find this balance? One of the joys of writing about it, how do you find a balance where you try and keep the terminology to a minimum, where you try and find a way of bringing it to life a little bit. So it's not just a word that you've got to memorize and take an exam on or something. So it's in school. But this is something that's happening. This is something you could get excited about, and that word now has a resonance for you. So how do you put that into words? These are just great things to try and do. And the other reason that I love doing it is that you learn a lot yourself from trying to do it. You try and put it into words, and you realize, hang on a minute, I don't understand this myself either. Here I am trying to explain something, and you realize, well, no, this doesn't make any sense. As soon as you put it in really plain language, you begin to realize where all your own kind of inconsistencies, logical inconsistencies are. So I find it really irons out my own thinking, and so it's I'm calling it kind of a dialogue, but it for me it really is.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love Brian Cox. I used to listen to him like 10 years ago, and it's like poetic. And you have this guy who's blowing your mind, but it's fun. You can almost kick back and listen, and it's almost like music in a way. And it gives you this imagination of what he's describing. And you're doing the same thing with biology and chemistry. And I feel like it's poetic. It really is, with your writing and the way you speak to it. So it does a good service. And I would love to know, like, do you think physicists and biologists have a hard time understanding each other's fields because of the way that we approach it, you know?
Yes, I don't know if it's the way that we approach it. I mean, physicists hate the terminology in biology. It really puts people off. Physicists love first principles, and there aren't very many first principles in biology. And I guess I'm not much of a physicist, but I like first principles, and I like to try and understand things as easily and simply as I possibly can. It doesn't mean that's how they are, but at least if you can explain the essence of something in a simple way, then you feel like you've got somewhere. And that's a little bit of a physicist's mentality, I would say. So I'm unusual among biologists in that I don't relish all of these terms and all of this information. And I try to find what is the essence of these things. Actually, there's an old phrase that there's two types of biologists. There's the lumpers and the splitters. The splitters are the people who are, naming 1,000 different species of plant or something. They can see the differences between everything. Nothing is the same, and you avoid general principles. And then the lumpers are the people who say, I mean, I caused horror with one guy. I basically described a tree as photosynthesis on a stick. A lot of biologists would hate that, but in my mind, that's the essence of what a tree is doing. It's photosynthesis. What's the commonality is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Lumpers and splitters. So you have 2 labs. That's pretty crazy to have to try to manage that much probably feedback and information and what you guys are discovering. And one's focused on the origins of life. And that's a big question and a lot to study. Can you go into these 2? And then the other one's studying more mitochondria on fruit flies. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, maybe we could go into them.
Well, they have more in common than I had realized. I mean, you could say I have 2 labs. They are on different floors, and they do work on different things. But they're both linked by energy flow, and they're both linked by a lot of methodology as well. So my work on the origin of life is really about where does structure come from, and where do the kind of, let's put it this way, think about the way that we have a cardiovascular system, and we're breathing and we're taking in oxygen and taking in food and so on. We're delivering it to the mitochondria inside our cells. And so respiration is more or less continuous. It's generating this electrical potential on the membranes, and there are trillions and trillions of them in our cells. And this is continuous. This goes on our whole life, and when it stops, we're dead. It's as simple as that. So how did that get going? I mean, this is a tremendous amount of organization. Well, one of the environments where I think life might have started is deep sea hydrothermal vents. What are they providing? Well, they're providing the gases that modern cells use to make organic material from, so carbon dioxide and hydrogen are used as the basis for making carboxylic acids, amino acids, fatty acids, sugars, and so on. So, but the building blocks of all the rest of life. That's in autotrophic metabolism. That's your starting point? Well, these gases are provided in these hydrothermal systems. They don't react very much, though, and cells use enzymes and genes to kind of break down the barriers to these gases reacting and coax it out step by step. So how would you get all of that going? Well, structure and ion gradients, so effectively differences in pH across barriers. So a cell, again, it's got an inside and an outside. It's got a membrane around it, and a bacterial cell has got this electrical charge on the membrane, and that is powering work. That's powering the reaction between carbon dioxide and hydrogen to make all this stuff. And in hydrothermal systems, you basically got the same thing. You've got cell-like pores in the rocks with gradients of protons, so difference in pH between the outside and the inside, different electrical potential on the outside and the inside. And that, in principle, could drive the reaction between these gases to make stuff, continually making organic material. And because you've got continuous flow through this system, you should be continually making stuff. Now, that can sound uncomfortably like an assertion, but it's also a plan for an experiment. You simply try and set it up in a lab and try and have this flow, try and have this structure, and see if we can make stuff. And it better be the right stuff. And the reality is you don't make very much, but it is the right stuff. And why don't we make so much? Well, it boils down to what's the pressure of hydrogen gas? You need it at a relatively high pressure. What's the actual metals in this barrier? What are the best catalysts to use here, and so on? So that there's lots of scope for improvement. But I would say over the last 10 years or so, it's gone from being, I won't say hand waving, because I think there's more to it than that. But to there've been several labs. It's not just me doing this kind of thing, trying to do the chemistry of life in the absence of genes and enzymes. And it's really the first steps, but it seems to work. And it's encouraging that, give us another 10 years and we may have got quite a long way towards it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And tell me a little bit about mitochondria and how you got so enamored with it and why you started to drill so deep into that. And then maybe what the practical implications are for technology and medicine and thinking about our health for the future as just individuals.
So all of this that I've just been saying about structure and energy flow and hydrothermal vents and pores and so on, that's how a cell works. A cell is also, it's a pore-like thing with a membrane around it and charge on those membranes. And there's a continuous flow, like a cardiovascular system. There's a continuous flow of energy that you've got, constant delivery of food, hydrogen in the case of the origin of life. In the case of mitochondria, then literally food, glucose or whatever it may be. So there's very similar commonalities between mitochondria and bacterial cells, and mitochondria were bacterial cells 2 billion years ago, and they've been incorporated into our own cells, and they're no longer bacteria. You can't culture them by themselves. They're really tightly integrated into our own cells, but they still they generate energy in exactly the same way that they always did, and they retain some kind of bacterial-like heritage. So, including their own genes, which is perhaps the most important and interesting thing, mitochondria is only just a handful. In our own case, there's 37 of them. It varies. It's as many as 100 in some single-celled critters. But, it's never very many, but they're always doing roughly the same kind of thing, which is they seem to be needed for respiration to work properly. Take them away and you don't have respiration anymore. And the thing is then, we actually, the idea of a human genome is a bit of a misnomer. We have two genomes. We've got the main genome in the nucleus, and then we've got this tiny mitochondrial genome, but we need thousands of copies of that in every cell. Otherwise, we don't work properly. And that leads to all kinds of interesting questions about, well, how do you make sure that with all these thousands of copies, what happens if you start getting mutations in them? what if the balance of mutations to normal mitochondrial DNA changes? A lot of evolution seems to have been built out of this. Why are there two sexes? One sex, the female sex, passes on the mitochondrial genes. Males do not. So my kids don't have my mitochondrial DNA. This is one of the deepest distinctions between the two sexes. So there's all kinds of things like that. Now, if we have a kind of a mismatch between our mitochondrial DNA and the genes we have in the nucleus, if they don't work that well together, then you can have a disease, and there are mitochondrial diseases. But a lot of them, a lot of the time, they work well enough together that you don't have an overt disease. But perhaps that increases your risk of getting diabetes or cancer or whatever it may be. So there's far more mainstream diseases that affect us all, which link to how mitochondria work. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing in the lab with flies, is we're mismatching the mitochondrial DNA against the nuclear genes to see, well, just how bad can this be? How normal is it? Is it something that really leads to differences in lifespan or differences in fertility or anything like that? And ironically, what you measure in the end very often is the membrane potential, it's the Krebs cycle intermediates. It's the same thing that my group downstairs working on the origin of life is measuring. So there's a weird continuity between two groups that should be working on completely different questions, but it turns out they're working on something very similar.
That's amazing. And what has it made you do on the most fundamental level as a human, just for your own health? What have you started to come up with that would make mitochondrial health better? Is it because it seems like there's some things that you're probably discovering in the Krebs cycle and all this stuff that you're going, okay, this makes sense. It hasn't been fully proven, but maybe I should start implementing these just basic fundamentals into my life.
Yeah. The only thing that I really do is try and get my mitochondria to keep working. And the way to do that is to eat reasonably well and to exercise reasonably often. There's all kinds of, shortcuts that you could try, and I'm tempted by some of them. One that I could mention is nicotinamide riboside, or NMN, or something like that, which people are taking as a supplement, and it works on the flies. It seems to improve respiration. The trouble with just any one pill is you've got a system which is pushing in one direction, and you're trying to prevent that from happening by just interacting in one place. Doing something like exercise or changing your diet, you're interacting with the entire system. It seems to be a much more potent way of doing it. But, people have been doing this for centuries, and we know it's not going to extend your lifespan. It might extend your healthy lifespan. I would hope so. Whether we can get beyond that is a different question.
Yeah, when I start to think of this stuff just as a person who's not a scientist, and I hear all this bioelectricity and how much it really is part of our being, and then the light story, I keep hearing more and more about how we're in these inferior lighting environments where we're inside now, we're not outside, and how much that plays a role in mitochondrial health. That makes so much sense to me, that being outside in natural light environments would be probably one of the most beneficial things we could do too, right?
Yes, I think just being active, being outside, just living life as humans have done for millennia seems like a no-brainer, really, doesn't it? And we're not. We're living really, I would say, very unhealthy lives, most of the time. It's amazing that we remain as healthy as we do, given how far removed from a healthy life most of us are, and how little you can get away with doing to try and get your act back together again. I say I go running. I'm talking about 2 or 3 miles maximum, 2 or 3 times a week. This is hardly a big deal, but it makes a noticeable difference. I can tell the difference. So, in some respects, it would be nice to go a step up and spend a lot more time getting my health together, but that will be a much less time doing the other things I really want to do. So that's not going to happen either. So you find yourself investing minimum time required to do what you need to do.
Yeah. Well, one of the healthiest things is to be inspired and to do what you love, and it seems like you're somewhat obsessed in a healthy way with what you're doing. So that drives you too and gives you a lot more energy than what you would do if you were.
It's kind of very easy to be obsessed by it, I have to say. It's not that I intend to be obsessed.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. Can you describe some of what I've heard you describe the complexity of, say, proteins and how they function and how they look, and just sort of do what a Brian Cox would do with the nature of the cosmos, but you do it with cells and you do it with biology so well. Do you mind doing that a little bit?
Well, so if I say protein to my dad who died a year ago, but he would immediately think of a slab of meat, a steak or something. And now, if you say protein to a biochemist, what they're going to think of is a whole string of amino acids joined together, maybe a couple of hundred of them, and then they twist into a shape. And if you can see that shape, then they can be astonishingly beautiful shapes that you have from these things. And they're machines. They move. They do things. And there's various animations that people will have seen of, for example, proteins practically walking along zip wires in the body. I suppose my favorite example is a protein called the ATP synthase, which sits in the mitochondria, in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it's got a rotating motor which sits in the membrane itself, and it's literally spinning at a rate of around about 500 revolutions per second. So it's an extraordinary rate, and that rotation is driving an axle which is changing the I suppose the shape of the rest of the protein, so that it's opening up an active site, banging something in, binding it, and another one opens, and so it's a really dynamic structure. We have, I'm not sure exactly how many in a single mitochondrion, but something in the order of maybe 10 to 20,000 of these things in a single mitochondrion, all of them rotating at around about 500 up to 500 rotations a second, powered by this flow of protons from one side of the membrane to the other side. So the structure is really critically important here. Without the structure, this enzyme would do nothing at all. They're all proteins all the time. They're always changing shape, and they always require energy to change shape. So nothing works in biology without this constant flow of energy. And the source of all of that flow of energy is this charge on the membrane. And the ATP synthase is this machine, which is kind of it's the primary user, if you like, of this. So cells in my mind are incredibly animated places. So they're absolutely stuffed full. I think of them like a city. And the proteins are like the buildings in the city. And cars and things are the small molecules that are passing between the proteins. So proteins are giant molecules in a cell. Unlike, buildings just sit there and don't really do anything. Maybe it's more like a windmill or something. These are giant machines that are doing things, moving around in 3 dimensions. This is not a kind of a city like London where everything's on the ground. It's more like some fantasy movie or something where everything's changing shape and direction. So it's an amazing world, a cell, and it's kind of hard to describe. But we're obliged to do it really in terms that we understand. Talk about cities or about buildings or whatever it may be. It's very difficult to convey what it's really like. I'm not sure we really can understand. Whenever we do an animation or we do an image, we're focusing on aspects of it only. We never have a sense of the whole workings of the system.
Yeah, it's so complex and weird. It seems like biology is so much weirder and more interesting even than physics, because like as you're describing that, you can use your imagination to almost put yourself inside of almost like the underbelly of like a manufacturing plant, and you start to see all these different functions. And then if you zoom out of that and you see where it's being shipped, like Amazon or some company like this, and how things are just being shipped all over the world. And I don't know, but with cells, it seems to me to be I don't know, like we're in this interdimensional, multi-complex living ecosystem, but it's just happening on these micro levels. I don't know. How do we describe this to the public? How do you do your best to do that when you're writing? Is it just like you're just using your imagination and you're taking what you've learned and tried to synthesize it down for the average person to have that image?
Um, I guess so. I mean, the other thing is, whenever you try and come up with any kind of a metaphor that explains how things work, there's a couple of things. One of them is going to be wrong. It's going to be misleading in some profound, important way, because we're always, you can't believe it too much. You can compare it to something like a city, but there's only a certain level to which that's true. So I've become, I'm wary of doing it too much, and I'm wary of doing it in a way that implies here's how it really is. So you've got to be a little careful in how you're conveying these things. But without trying to bring it to life in that way, then it's as dry as dishwater. Well, it's not very dry, is it? But it's dull as dishwater. It's very hard to kind of capture the excitement of how I imagine it might be, without trying to bring it to life in that way. But as I say, if you do it too much, and some people really hate this kind of way of trying to describe biochemistry, especially biochemists. For the most part, they really don't like me kind of trying to anthropomorphize it in that way. And I can live with that. It's just how it is. I suppose there's an ulterior motive as well, which is more about just trying to find things in common with people. If you're writing, or if you just want to communicate at all, or if you're just worried about the state of the world and you would like it if people found more in common with each other, then you've got to find a way of being yourself, and for yourself not to be, say, repellent to other people. So you've got to find the aspects of yourself that are more likely to be congenial to others, and see if you can get that across. So it's kind of, if you're writing a book, you've got time to think about these things. You've got time to process it. You've got time to wonder, is this the right way of doing it? Or is this just too much? Or page after page of this kind of breathless excitement about a cell, it can wear people down. So you've got to find and you're never going to get it right, but you've got to try and find the best balance that you can.
Yeah. No, I'm sure when you're around your colleagues, it's fine. You guys speak the similar language, but when you're at, say, a cocktail party or something, and you've been enamored with this work for decades, it's probably like you're walking around with all this information and understanding about these worlds that no one's even put 2% of their life force energy into thinking about. So it can feel sort of alienating, I'm sure, too, to some degree.
I generally try and avoid talking about that at cocktail parties. Not that I go to very many. For some reason, I'm not invited.
It's probably better off. I'd love the Life Ascending book, and you start to discover all of these ways that life has, I guess, invented or created or evolved these beautiful things. You went through about 10, and I'd love to hear about photosynthesis and some of the others that are sort of mind-blowing. Yeah,
I mean, photosynthesis, it's I've never worked on it directly, but I keep on writing about it, and the reason is it's partly it's linked to things that I do think about, which is how do you turn gases into organic molecules. And really the photosynthesis bit is just the sun is used to effectively activate these molecules to make them more reactive. So it's very similar in a weird way to what's happening 5 kilometers down at the bottom of the ocean in a deep sea hydrothermal vent. It's the same chemistry that's happening down there that it is with the sun up in the atmosphere. So there's also something that feels very miraculous about photosynthesis, the way that it turns gases into solids, into plants, and ultimately into us as well. It's one of the greatest miracles in biology. And it's an everyday miracle. And it occurred very early on the Earth, which is to say about 2.5 to 3 billion years ago, maybe earlier than that, but in cyanobacteria. And it took a lot. It took a couple of billion years after that before you got through to land plants. So it was a hell of a ride. It's really interesting that you have this process of photosynthesis, which is giving rise to oxygen as a waste product, and which is converting CO2 and taking the hydrogen out of water and sticking it on to make organic molecules. That it's been doing that for 3 billion years, and yet only in the last 500 million or so has it kind of produced a world that we would recognize. So why the delay? So there's all these really interesting questions there as well. And animals really arose before plants, before land plants. Plenty of algae in the oceans and so on. But again, it's just unexpected in this story, and I just find that fascinating and fun to write about.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more from that book, the other ones too, but I also just on that, what do you think about the whole universe teeming with life, like ours or something similar? If you're in some form of solar system throughout our galaxy or throughout other galaxies, do you think it's common then, life? It must be, right?
I do and I don't. So I think life itself is probably quite common. Life itself meaning bacteria. The conditions, again, you could argue all day with people, what do you need? Do you need to have water? Do you need to have carbon? Do you need cells? All the rest of it. I think there's a good argument to say you do need those things. You don't necessarily need them. It's just that they make everything a lot easier. And because they're almost ubiquitous, you're going to get the same kinds of life forming all around galaxies. So any wet, rocky planet or moon, I would say, has a good shot of producing cell-like, bacterial-like life, which uses carbon, and even which produces the same kinds of basic molecules. Because if you start with CO2 and you've got the same kind of structures, you end up doing the same kind of things, the same kind of chemistry. This is what we have, seems to be favoured chemistry that arose before the genes, which is, again, something which is coming out of work on the origin of life. So all of that says bacteria are really common. And bacteria arose close on 4 billion years ago on Earth, but then complex cells, so plants and animals and fungi and algae and things like amoeba, they're all composed of this one cell type, the eukaryotic cell. And these are large complex cells, but with mitochondria. So how did they arise? Almost certainly there was some bacterial-like cell, Asgard archaeon, which acquired an endosymbiont, so a cell inside a cell, and that cell inside the cell went on to become the mitochondria. So this is an idea that goes back to Lynn Margulis back in the 1960s. Actually, goes back much before that, but she was the person who really made it clear. And it's always been controversial, and it still is controversial.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the reasons are exactly. I mean, in my mind, at least, it shouldn't be so controversial. It's kind of incontrovertible that you get this power pack and it's got its own genes and it scales up what is possible. The thing is, it only occurred once in life on Earth. And that could be that it's misleading. It actually arose hundreds of times, thousands of times, millions of times, but everything else just disappeared without trace. But I think that's not the case, because plants and animals have got, if you look at them under a microscope, they've got basically an awful lot of stuff going on. And a plant cell and an animal cell, they've both got the nucleus. They've got this membranes inside called the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. And they do things like sex, so producing gametes, fusing cells together, lining up chromosomes, doubling them, crossing over between them, separating. All of these, a plant cell and an animal cell does basically the same thing. So there's all of these things that we have in common, like a textbook's worth of things that they have in common. And bacteria don't have any of those things. And archaea, which are similar to bacteria in their appearance, they don't have any of those things really either. So why do plants and animals, despite completely different lifestyles, why do they have the same kit? And I think the reason is that, well, you acquire an endosymbiont, which is in fact bacteria living inside you, and they're nearly as big as you are, and that changes the whole course of evolution. And you're adapting to having endosymbionts, and that's why plant cells and animal cells have got the same kit, because that kit arose not as evolution to a way of life like photosynthesis or eating other things, but to having endosymbionts. So that then begins to look as if, okay, this is a long evolutionary distance that's forced on you by having an endosymbiont, which is a rare thing to begin with. Chances of that going wrong is really quite high. So maybe complex life is not going to be that common after all. And the fact that it seems to have happened once on Earth, you can't say for sure that's what happened, but it's beginning to look more reasonable that it is genuinely difficult to come up with complex life. So again, then I would say bacteria are everywhere, but complex life much less common.
Yeah. What does this mean for you when you see like Michael Levin's work and we're trying to recreate life in a lab, and how complex you've seen it is just to get to where we are, and then to try to use AI and to try to create these new emergent phenomena? What do you think about what he's doing?
He's doing amazing work. He's pretty much generally working with eukaryotic cells, so cells which have got the nucleus and so on. So they've already got a large genome, and they're quite complex cells, and they basically got a lot of ways of navigating through morphospace, if you like. They can structure themselves in all kinds of different ways that bacteria are not going to be able to come up with. So they got a lot of resources at their disposal, but what's really surprising is the way that they seem to be capable of kind of building themselves into all kinds of different shapes and different functionalities that are not what you would have imagined.
Yeah.
And they don't seem to correspond. I mentioned genes and genomics and gene sequencing earlier on. We've had decades of biology being dominated by this view that everything is about genetic information, that genes effectively control everything. And well, they don't. They're important. You can't get away from them being important. But at the origin of life, we're dealing with structure and energy flow, and the genes emerged in that context. This is an assertion on my part, but I could back it up. And there's the metabolism and structure and energy flow are all effectively preceding genes. And the way that cells work now, if you change the energy flow, if you change the metabolism, you're going to change which genes are switched on and which genes are switched off. You're going to just change development, in effect. So it's not entirely surprising then that you're going to get different types of morphology, different types of development, and things that perhaps had never been seen before, because you just changed in a way that hadn't necessarily been done before, the way that energy flow across these structures actually works. So I think, again, he's bringing it back into the mainstream. And one of the reasons it's in the mainstream is that he is doing good molecular biology, and that's the currency that people understand. So if you only talk about fields in biology, then most molecular biologists will back away because it's suspicious.
Yeah.
But if you are talking about voltage across the plasma membrane and gap junctions and maintaining a voltage, and that voltage has an effect through, let's say, sodium, potassium antiporters or whatever it may be, and that is going to change gene expression, then you're talking in a language that molecular biologists are quite comfortable with. And over all of that, what you're really saying is that voltage is actually driving development here. And that if you've got a voltage map, you can predict which bits are going to become the head or the eyes, and which bit's going to become the tail, and all of this. So voltage has been long overlooked. It's not easy to measure, and it's easy to get it wrong, and it's important to do it well. But I think he's driving a path that way.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear him speak. He's very good at communicating it too, for just even people like me that have no idea what's going on. But it's mind blowing to listen to what he's doing. It almost seems like sci-fi or futuristic, in a way, but he's definitely on the edge of something beautiful. There was something you said there, and it made me wonder if the paradigms that most biologists and the way that we think about medicine and health being locked into this hereditary model or thinking about genes in a certain way. And if we started to get back to what you're talking about, would that completely change the way that we think about health and medicine and technology for the future? If we started thinking about energy first and the way that metabolism is under preceding it, if you will?
Yes, I mean, I think that Doug Wallace, I don't know if you came across Doug Wallace, he's been a kind of, I won't say cheerleader for mitochondria, but one of the leading experts on mitochondria. But he's for decades been arguing that they are central to health, and that medicine has been set up with really an anatomical view of the body. So even you go to a hospital, you're going to go to nephrology for your kidneys, or you're going to go to neurology for your head, your brain, whatever it may be. So it's fundamentally anatomical in the way that it's organized. And the second thing is it's all about Mendelian genetics, which is to say we're looking for mutations in genes in the nucleus, which are inherited in a Mendelian way, which is effectively predictable. And the problem with mitochondria, mitochondria, you have them in all organs in the body, and they're not inherited in a Mendelian way. They're inherited from the mother only, and they can be inherited in all kinds of odd mixtures of mutations or non-mutations, and they can go into, they can go into different tissues with different ratios of mutations to non-mutations and so on. And they can work differently against different nuclear backgrounds. And the nuclear background is different in different tissues, different organs and so on. So it becomes a bizarre and really difficult workspace to navigate through. And so mitochondrial diseases became, I think, perceived as rare and awkward and difficult. And only a limited subset of medical researchers ever worked on them. And I think the reality is they're really central. The way that mitochondria function is really central to living, and therefore everything that goes wrong with living, and that includes aging. So the way that it works is becoming much more mainstream, but still, we don't know. I mean, I'm doing some work with Mike Levin, for example. We don't really know. The mitochondria generate a voltage and will generate electromagnetic fields, and so does the plasma membrane. And the voltage maps that he's talking about are across the membrane, the plasma membrane of cells. How do these two things talk to each other? If you change the voltage in the mitochondria, what happens at the plasma membrane, or vice versa? We don't really know. Whenever anyone works closely on mitochondria, you tend to have to strip away all the rest of the cell or the organ or whatever to look at the mitochondria. So you end up not knowing what's happening anywhere else. And likewise, if you're looking at the plasma membrane, you don't know what's going on in the mitochondria. So there's kind of enormous gaps where there ought to be some knowledge, and you don't even notice that there's a gap there until you specifically ask yourself these questions. And then you realize it's stupid that there's a gap there. How come nobody's really ever worked on this? And it's difficult to get at. But it's partly, this is why we don't really know. It's not about Mendel and just genetic mutations in the nucleus. It's not about anatomy in terms of I've got a problem with my heart, but not with other aspects. It's the entire system, and it's the energy flow through that system. And in many respects, you could argue it's closer to Chinese versions of medicine, for example. Which has a different holistic view of the body, and this is a different tradition to a lot of Western medicine. It's not to say Western medicine has got it all wrong, it's just that it's missed a large important aspect of it, and we don't really know yet just how important is it. I would say very, but yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating. I actually years ago discovered acupuncture and found this Chinese medicine
Mm.
doctor who helped me to understand that there's these meridians and that your body's electricity. And I literally went from having a back injury and back pain and I went to all these specialists. And as soon as I got to that guy by the third session, I was better. And so
Mm.
it's not to say that that's going to work for everyone or that it's a blanket statement, but it started to help me to even think of the body as electricity first, and I think that's a big paradigm shift for our medical system in the West, is to start thinking along these lines. And hopefully newer scientists are inspired by all of your guys' work. And hopefully there's more mitochondrial studies in the future and that we start shifting that direction. Huh?
I think it is going in that direction. How far it can get, I don't know, because it is intrinsically complex. I think there is a desire for it to be simple. There's always a desire, and writing books, I have a desire to make it simple. And this is one place where I come face to face with the problem that it's not. So mitochondrial diseases and the way that they function is intrinsically one of the more difficult things to get your head around. And therefore, what are you going to do about it? And I mentioned earlier on, what do I do about it? Well, I go back to try and get some exercise and try and eat reasonably well, because those are things that I know will have some effect. And other things that I could do, I have no idea really what would be the longer term consequences of doing that. When I say longer term, I mean over several years or longer. Any change you want to make to the way that your body's working, you better try and make sure that you can do it in a sustained way over years. Otherwise, it's no good. So if you're thinking the same thing then about taking supplements or whatever it may be, then you've got to think, what are the long-term consequences of doing this? And you're not simply, you've got to keep balance. And you could possibly keep balance by, balancing all kinds of different supplements, but we don't really have any good information on how that's going to work out in the long run, and you don't know what you're missing. So that's why I don't do it personally, but some very smart people do, and who am I to say? I'll keep watching them to see if something unexpected and interesting happens.
Yeah, I feel like people like you understand that when you start to affect one little part, you take a supplement or you do something, you start tweaking in this way, there's so many unintended consequences that you can't measure. There's like all these domino effects. And so, but when you get back to nature and to what worked for millennia for the human body, it seems to be more practical and more intelligent, really. It's almost like removing things would be better than adding more things. And you're having like people that take testosterone replacement therapy and things like that so quickly. You're like, well, there's going to be a whole chain of events that now happen that you can't even imagine.
And I don't know what they're going to be. And it may be that they're great. I can't say that it's necessarily going to be bad, but my suspicion is that there will be things you hadn't counted on, which you wish would not have happened.
Absolutely. And what about, I know this isn't really your specificity of study, but consciousness and the way Michael Levin thinks about embodied minds and where does it emerge from? And you go from a single celled organism and all of a sudden you have this like awareness and this conscious being. And what do you think about consciousness and the nature of consciousness?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it increasingly in relation to mitochondria, which might sound a bit perverse, but if you wonder, I suppose, as a biologist, one of the things which is really interesting to me is that very few biologists will ever talk about consciousness. They prefer to avoid the subject. Now, if you ask them, is it real? Does it exist? They say, of course it does, yes. And if you were to say, did it evolve by natural selection? They'll say yes. And if you say, well, does that mean that there must be, some advantage that it offers that which is selectable? They'll say yes. So, in fact, we're talking very normal currency here. And as soon as you get there, you think, okay, so what is its purpose? What is it good for? How did it get selected, and in what? And one of the things that's become, I've been reflecting on, it's partly we're doing some work on how anesthetics work, and it's partly just wondering about metabolism. and wondering about AI and whether or not consciousness is going to emerge from sufficiently complex neural nets and so on. And my feeling is that it won't. Not as we understand or cherish consciousness. So I think we cherish above all else feelings and the felt experience. So what are feelings? And this is the question where I'm wondering just how widespread are feelings? Does it require a neural network? If so, why do some give rise to feelings and other neural nets don't appear to give rise to feelings? Is it about computation at all? And I'm left thinking, well, maybe it's more about metabolism. So in a single bacterial cell, you've got about 1 billion metabolic reactions happening every second after second after second. It's just a kind of a flood of reactions. And you think, okay, how does this cell, which is the kind of the composite output of all of these reactions, how does it have coherent behavior? How does it manage to marshal all of this flood of reactions into behavior which is semi-rational, which is kind of better than random? And part of the answer, I think, is that, well, metabolism generates an electrical membrane potential on the plasma membrane of the cell, so the boundary between the inside of the cell and the outside world. And that electrical membrane potential drives metabolism. So there's a kind of an interesting circularity there. And the metabolism that's generating is also depending on the outside world, on oxygen or food or whatever it may be. So you've effectively got this interface between the cell, the entity, and its behavior, and its behavior in relation to an environment. I don't have enough oxygen. I don't have enough food, whatever it may be. And somehow you've got to take stock of this billion reactions a second and figure out what should I do. And I think what a membrane potential is doing here is more or less integrating them into a similar state. So they're all behaving. They've got to push together to generate that membrane potential, and that's pushing back on the system to power work of one sort or another. So it can give you a readout, more or less an integrated real-time readout of your state in relation to the world. And that state is a physical state. It's the electrostatic and electromagnetic fields generated by this membrane potential. So it seems like there's an answer to a question there, and that is what is a feeling? And the answer then would be, well, it's a kind of early warning system of what my metabolic state is in relation to the world, early enough that I can do something about it, like fire up my flagellum and move over there. So it's more or less at the level of good or bad. I'm not imputing, serious feelings to bacteria, but to this idea of how do I integrate all of this chemistry into behavior which makes sense. What is a feeling in that context? Well, I think a feeling is a kind of a readout of your metabolic state that says I'm good now or I'm bad now in relation to this environment. Go over there or stay here. And that's, I find it a pleasing way of thinking about it. Whether there's any truth in it is another matter, but anesthetics can begin to get at some of those questions. They make predictions about what should be affected then. And if that's right, then what we'd end up with AI would be probably, if it's embodied, I would imagine it would be self-aware. There seems to be a logical outcome of having a kind of an iterative framework and an embodiment. I don't see why there would not have all kinds of aspects of consciousness that matter to us, like self-awareness, but feelings, which perhaps is the most precious of all, I think they emerge from metabolism and would not emerge from any kind of anything which is not basically wet and messy.
Yeah. That's the hard part, is the biology is wet and messy. And then a lot of times we get stuck in the information space or the language and the models, and we get locked into the maps, and we lose track of the wet, messy stuff and how complex it probably really is. And so you probably resonate with Carl Friston and Anil Seth's view of consciousness the most. Am I guessing that right? Or?
Yes, and they both have touched on single cells. And the idea that the cell membrane is what Carl Friston calls a Markov blanket, but basically it's It's translating between the stuff that's happening outside in the world out there into the different language that metabolism is inside a cell. That somehow this chemistry inside the cell has to tell the cell where it thinks it is and what it should do. It's got to translate from it's too hot, it's too cold, there's not enough oxygen, there's not enough food, into biochemistry that says my NADH level is a little high now, and my ATP-ADP ratio is sinking a little bit, and my membrane potential has gone. It's just done that. Somehow you've got to impute from all of that it's too hot, there's no oxygen, get out.
Yeah.
So that's very much Carl Friston language. And I mean, it's not Carl Friston language, but that's the way that active inference about your predicament in a different language, having translated it through a Markov blanket inside, is the kind of thing that Carl Friston with Anil Seth and other people talk about.
Yeah, and then there's the idea of qualia. I talked to this Japanese neuroscientist, now Tsuchiya is his name, and he has this interesting perspective about trying to go into the feeling of being conscious and the feeling of the existential experience, and it's so immeasurable and so hard to describe. But you're going into the metabolism, and it's more like, all right, we're bumping up against edges and trying to figure out how to survive and thrive in the environment. But then when you get to the human consciousness, it sure is weird. Like, we're artists and we're poets and we have music and we have the strangeness of being human compared to other life on this planet is so much different. If we, not to say we're special and that we should glorify it, but it sure is weird that we're so unique and that we seem to be driven by meaning and narratives and language. And I always find that to be what's so strange about people is that, yeah, I understand these fundamentals of consciousness for survival and for evolution, but then when you get to our weird species, it sure does get strange.
Yes, I mean, I have very little to say about that, really. I mean, I think you mentioned qualia and feelings, and what I'm trying to do with what I was just saying is try and work out what's the simplest imaginable form of a feeling, and I'm suggesting it's a metabolic state. Yeah. And I would say the same applies to us, that we also have feelings about what state our body is in relation to the environment. And you know, a lot of work from Anil Seth and people like Lisa Feldman Barrett is, you know, the way that we kind of construct, almost hallucinate a world out there by projecting what we think the world is going to be like. This is a projection. We also do the same with our own organs, with our bodies, so interoception, where we're trying to work out what do we think our own bodily state is right now and project into that. So it's very much, again, a kind of, we have a feed in from the body, and that feed in from the body is, I would perhaps argue, as some kind of metabolic readout that's saying, okay, my heart's doing all right here. It's beating at about the right number of beats, so it seems to be okay. And it's being fed in, and that is, you know, if there's something slightly wrong there, it's being interpreted by the brain, which is trying to then build an emotion. I'm really citing Lisa Feldman Barrett here, to build an emotion by effectively figuring out what's my bodily status, figuring out what's my context in the environment, putting the two together and saying, oh, I'm excited about this, or oh, I'm terrified about that, or oh, I've just got bellyache, or whatever it may be. We you know, it's all inference as to what's going on, and there's I guess there's so much logic to it. I'm not the right person to talk about where good and evil and truth and beauty and all the rest of it come from. It's not something I work on at all. But the only thing I would say is it follows from being a biologist and to assuming that all of these things evolved, that all of this meaning in our lives doesn't mean to say it evolved as such, but it means it's not imposed on us by some objective outer you know, God, whatever it may be. So in my mind, we have to explain meaning from society, from people, from the relationships that we have, is not an objective aspect of the universe. Again, that's just my way of thinking, which may be just completely wrong.
I love it. And if you're thinking the way that you're thinking, isn't it quite frustrating when you look at the current landscape, and I guess the landscape all the way back through history of just ideology and stories that get us into so much dis-ease and inability to connect with each other. And it's like we're fighting over these stories and these ideas when we could be focused on the truth and seeking the truth and
Well,
trying to
we can't
understand.
agree on what the truth is, and no doubt what I
Right,
just said will be very offensive to some people. I
right.
don't intend to offend them. Maybe I'm wrong,
Hmm.
but people will react that way. There was a very interesting short clip that I saw of Ian McGilchrist recently. I don't know if you came across him, but he was talking about truth as being something that we discover, as being a value, an objective value that's kind of out there in the universe. I mean, his implication was it's coming from God. And that it's, why would scientists who say that we don't have any the meaning is constructed, why then do we have so much onus on truth with a small t? And it was an interesting point, and it left me reflecting. And the way I was reflecting in the end is that, well, it's the only way of actually improving and getting at an answer, which is a reasonable answer. If you don't have truth, if you don't privilege truth as being somehow better than anything else, so in the short term, you might want to privilege something which is not truth, which is helpful for you right now for your own selfish agenda. But over a longer term, the only way you're going to make any progress is by privileging truth and doing your best to find out what truth is. And there's a beautiful link there between active inference, the kind of hallucination that we're trying to do to make sense of the world and try and work out what's true. Is that a tiger over there, or is that just some shadows over there? You better get it right, which is to say, you want your inference to approximate to the truth. You want to be better than random about it. And the way that science works, the way that science privileges the truth, because we want our answers to, hold weight. To, we want to build an aeroplane. It's going to be built on principles that are true and correct and real. Otherwise, it's going to crash. So I don't see. I mean, although I rather liked his comments, I don't see science's belief in truth as being evidence for a need for some objective reality out there where truth is somehow God-given.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I always liked Richard Feynman and listening to him speak and write. And he would say it's not like we're seeking to understand the big truth or to get this one answer. It's more like we're just exploring the nature of consciousness, exploring the nature of reality, and we're seeking to understand more about it. And it just becomes more interesting. And then there's more questions, and it just keeps leading you further and further. So there is no final truth. It's more like it just becomes more and more interesting, and we find out more about it.
Yes, I mean, I think truth with a small t always for science.
Yeah.
And it's you'd like to know more about the world, and underpinning all of science, there's always some assumptions, and those assumptions include the assumption that we can actually even understand it at all. There's no guarantee that we will understand it, or that it is rational. That there's so many things that we just assume this to be true for our own comfort, and then hope for the best. And the fact is, it works better than anybody could ever have imagined. We do seem to have a control over the material world that seems to suggest that these ideas are broadly right, and they break down at the edge. They break down when we're getting to quantum physics and things. They break down in all kinds of interesting ways. So we know we don't know the whole picture, and we don't know what that means for what we take to be the truth of the small t. But to a first approximation, it works surprisingly well.
Yeah, and it makes me think about the power of belief and in the negative and in the positive, because truth versus belief is different, but doesn't mean that, like, then when you look at placebo studies and things like this, you're like, whoa, but the belief system that you have that you're getting better worked. So that's interesting that your belief systems shape the way that your physiology works. And it can be very negative too, but I've always wondered too about like things like the imagination and how Einstein or Edison or these people would come up with some of their greatest ideas by traveling inward and going into these imaginary realms. And that's where some of our best science also comes from, is from the combination of the arts and the exploration. And it's like science is like a creative discovery in symbiotic relationship where we're creating and discovering. They're the same coin in a way.
There's a lot of imagination in science.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we can ever know or understand reality. We can only imagine reality. And we're going to be limited by our own imagination. I was saying earlier on, trying to describe the inside of a cell, and this is what's in my head, and it's definitely wrong. It might bring it to life inside of the people's heads, but it's it's limited by what we know about something which is on a completely different scale and behaves in a completely different way. So it's problematic, but without that attempt to bring it to life, to infuse it with meaning, human meaning, then it's impossible to digest. And the way that we make any steps in science, I think, is by trying to find human meaning, to invest that into it, to try and leap in a metaphorical way to somewhere that seems interesting, and then to try and come up with imaginative ways of testing whether or not that's right. And before you know it, it's become science. To my mind, the way that science is taught in schools as a collection of dusty facts that you're supposed to memorize, going all the way back round to why people get put off doing biology, to this idea of you're in some crazy world where you're trying to make head or tail of it, and you're grasping at where the truth might lie, and imagining, daydreaming, coming up with experiments that you could do with the facility sometimes to even do them, and see if there's any truth in it. That's the daily practice of science, and it's just a great deal of fun, and it's interesting, and it's surprising. A lot of scientists talk about the importance of play. It's keeping this almost, it's kind of a playful mindset, but that's the imagination. It's just allowing your imagination to run riot through places that probably more sober people would say, be a proper scientist, grow up. But very often, good scientists will just allow their minds to play and play out through these possibilities and come up. I'm sure that's what Einstein was doing, come up with things that people hadn't thought of before because they weren't allowing themselves to play in that way.
Yeah, and I know this is a weird question, but do you think of psychedelics ever as a way to play and to get out of that normal frame? Because it can be a non-ordinary state.
I've never taken psychedelics, or at least I've taken magic mushrooms and things like that, but nothing very serious. And do I regret that? Yes, in some respects I do.
Interesting.
I didn't particularly... Why have I not? The reason I haven't is that I don't want to change my mind in a permanent way, and I fear that I would. So it's fear, basically. And I guess I quite like my mind the way it is, and I don't want to permanently alter it. Would it think very differently if I were on psychedelics? I'm sure it would, yes. I think to some extent I try and allow my mind to have the same range and freedom to rove where it wants to go and imagine things, almost as if I were on psychedelics, without taking them. Would it help people? I mean, I think there's going to be some trade-off, isn't there? Because there are downsides as well.
Yeah. No, I just was curious because someone like you has so much insight and imagination and understanding that these tools, if you want to call them that, are like these amplifiers, non-specific amplifiers. And it would probably permanently change you, which is the danger of it. But then I'm like, I wonder what he would come back with as far as insight, but you never know. And
the thing is, we were talking about Einstein and this way of seeing the world, but it was then backed up with a tremendous amount of hard maths and hard thinking. And, it was not as if that was it. Same for people like Darwin. He had a brilliant idea, but it was backed up with book after book of careful observations. So play is a big part of what science is, but then so is all the hard work that requires maybe more of a sober kind of a mind. So it's you need both.
Yeah. That's why I'm grateful for the musicians that don't get completely lost on the drugs and they can come back and actually write the songs. Some of the best music was written in those states, but I'm curious what you're writing now or wanting to write, and if you would ever consider writing a children's book to inspire younger people.
Well, I'm writing. I'm not writing anything at the moment apart from papers, and a grant application. But I have a contract to write a book on the origin of life. You might think all my books are on the origin of life, but this is an attempt to deal with the whole question going right the way through to genes and genetic information and molecular machines and cells and agency. So I really want to do the whole works from the beginning, from prebiotic chemistry right the way through, and there's obviously going to be some gaps, but I want to give it my best shot to see how much can I do of this. And I'll find out as I'm writing. Some of it I'm on very sure ground and I know exactly what I'm going to say, and some of it I've got at the back of my mind a small quiet panic about what on earth am I going to say about this. I'm hoping that over some months or a year or so before I have to actually hand in this book, I'll have plenty of time to kind of think through. So a children's book, yes, I do have something in mind, which I have two kids and they're grown up now. They're 20 and 18, so it's too late for my own kids. But I had it in mind because when I was reading them children's books when they were little, I was really struck by how kind of Lamarckian children's literature is. So how the crocodile, how the elephant got its trunk, its nose is pulled long by a crocodile. So it is inheriting changes from its own life. So not how natural selection is supposed to work. And that's all you get really in children's literature. It's either that or it's some kind of light, entertaining fact book. But what about a children's story? A story which is not going back in time to the world of the dinosaurs, because that's kind of an adventure story, but it's not science as such. Insofar as it's science, you're describing what dinosaurs look like and how you would deal with them. So the problem with evolution is you're always dealing with populations over generations. And it's a really uncomfortable way for humans to think. We like a hero or a heroine. We want to focus on the adventures of this person, and we can't do that with evolution. But it did strike me that we could do it with a bacterial cell that goes on dividing, and you could still say, well, one of these is still the same bacterial cell, and it can end up as the mitochondria in my own brain. So I could tell a story from the first person. I started writing this. My wife is quite a good artist. It's not really what she does, but she was going to illustrate it. I started writing it and I realized it had to be done in rhyming couplets. Don't know why I realized that, but it was only going to work in rhyming couplets, and I'm not a very good poet. So I made a start and I put it aside for the time being, but I'll come back to it one day.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I think we need more, like you said, good children's books that inspire more curiosity and wonder and seeking of truth. I get not the truth again, but seeking to understand more about the truth. But yeah, I thought it would be cool if you could write one. That would be awesome. Curious who your favorite writers are that have inspired you, and people in general that are alive that inspire you right now.
Well, I suppose one of the writers who brought me into science in the first place was Richard Dawkins. And it wasn't because I loved his book so much as I really didn't, but it's what a good science book should be, which is to say it challenges everything that you think about life and existence, and it was not easy to argue against. And there are arguments against it, and it's not the whole story, it's not the whole picture, but it's a life-changing book, and a lot of people who went into biology went in because of that kind of book. So that was a big inspiration. There's other people who just write amazingly well, sometimes quite dated. So people like J.B.S. Haldane, kind of back in the 1930s. He was from a very privileged family of lords and things. Quite a hardcore communist himself, but wrote with a kind of brio that came from the upper classes. But for Socialist Worker magazine. So really plain language, brilliant science communication. Again, very, very inspiring. Though I often find that I end up reading history more than science. And I find historians write really well, just in terms of the way that they marshal ideas, the weighting that goes on individual words. There's a beauty to the way that historians write very often that I get a lot from.
Is there a favorite writer in the historian field, like Durant or?
Yeah, I mean, one that made a big impression on me was Roger Crawley, who writing about the Venetian Empire and things like that. John Julius Norwich, writing about the Sicilian kingdoms. Beautiful writers. It's kind of, in some sense, it's not difficult content. It's very easy to write about that kind of thing. But then it's done in such a gracious way and with such insight into human motivations and so on. And I suppose one of the, again, in terms of I read these with thoughts of utility for my own writing, I don't really, but insofar as I do, how do you get at the motivations of scientists, of other scientists, and the social context in which people are working? That was the theme in my last book on the Krebs cycle. I wanted to kind of tell the stories of some of the pioneers of biochemistry. So how do you capture that in a way which a historian would savor? So that's the kind of an objective for me in front. I tend not to read novels very much anymore. I read an awful lot of novels when I was younger, and I'll probably come back to them. But not so much anymore.
And how do you find time to write, or how do you write? Do you write in structured form, like a daily practice, or how does it work? It's a lot of work.
I tend to be quite obsessive, so I'll keep coming back to it, and I find that I can squeeze in half an hour here, or 20 minutes there, or several hours, and I don't notice the time passing. Here, I can work 12 hours a day for a week if I ever have the opportunity to do that, which is pretty rare. So wherever and whenever I can, and I'm very glad that I can, because I think I find it really hard to put aside structured time. Some people seem to be able to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do 3 hours of work before breakfast and then do nothing else the rest of the day. I find that quite hard. I tend to squeeze it into my working day.
That's interesting. There was something lingering that was mRNA technology and where that field is going and what your understanding is of it and maybe some of the limitations and misdirections.
I don't have much to say about that, really.
Okay.
I guess you've got vaccines and things in mind there, do you? I'm not sure, but
yeah, just like it seems like it's an exploding field, and there's a lot of people that are saying it's so promising, and then there's a lot of people saying this is one of the most destructive technologies that we've created. And so I'm curious. I didn't know what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I don't. To be honest, I don't really have any on that. It's one of those things that I've taken it for granted. There's so many things as a scientist that you just accept that other scientists are doing good work and interesting work, and to some extent it's amazing to me that some of that technology works at all, but I'm fairly sure it does. So there's all kinds of things happening. You can't keep up with it all, and you kind of make a mental note, wow, and you by and large assume that people are doing good and responsible work. It's interesting to me. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists around these days, and most scientists are the opposite of conspiracy theorists. I think perhaps we're naive and gullible. We tend to assume the best in other scientists, and that's not always the case. There are people who are doing fraudulent work out there, who are making up data. It exists. It's also surprisingly difficult to replicate your own data. So I have some sympathy with the problem of replication of work, because it's always pleasing when you can replicate someone else's work. It always takes much longer than you thought it was going to, and it's quite distressing when you fail to replicate your own work and you have to keep on going because you now don't know, were you right the first time? Were you right when it didn't work? Which of the two is it? So stuff changes for reasons which are kind of almost unknowable, and most scientists live with that because we don't know everything. So you find your way of dealing with it. So as a backdrop to all of that, then you have technology-driven science in fields you don't know very much about, doing work which I'm not following closely enough to have an opinion on.
Yeah.
And I have insofar as I have an opinion at all, I assume it's good work because it seems to work. But I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's hard because there's so much tech right now being deployed exponentially, and it is hard to keep up with what's happening, and you could never do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to write your book or function in society. So,
yes, I mean, I think there's also a lot of hype around in science generally. People, for their careers, need to publish in good journals, and to get in good journals, you need to, I won't say fib a little bit, but you got to oversell your work. That's kind of understood by everybody. You'll be under pressure from universities who want to get, demonstrate value for money that the people they've employed and are paying for at society's expense are doing work which is in people's face in the media. So there's an awful lot of overselling of work going on, and feels like the origin of life where people care about it. It's going to get a newspaper headline. People are interested because it's a big question. Or, cancer, where people are worried that they're going to get cancer themselves. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of overclaims. There's a lot of, slightly misleading information. Maybe more than slightly misleading. I mean, I would say overly focused and saying that we've solved something, which is not the case.
yeah.
And I think people get very, very irritated and irked by that. We've seemed to get into this loop where what gets out to the public about science is really not the world that most scientists live in. And what scientists put out to the world very often is not what they would say to each other. And I think this is one of the reasons why the public in general has picked up on this idea that we are being misled somehow. I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy. I would say it's just this kind of like structural politics going on. We have structural problems in science and things as well. And overall, it works, but in most details, it doesn't work that well.
Yeah. Underneath it all is just people. And it's like, okay, people are messy.
Yeah. Yes.
What are you excited about in your field and in your labs in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oof, that's a long way to think. I'm excited. We're doing work on the origin of the genetic code. And that kind of is going from the chemistry and biochemistry that I've been doing into RNA, actually, and how that works. So outside my comfort zone, but there are patterns in the genetic code that suggest there's a link between metabolism and the code itself. And so there's really interesting questions. How did that get going? How does it bootstrap itself up into something more complex? So that's a little bit of a preoccupation at the moment. And then the other side, which is really fascinating, I think, is the anesthetics and whether or not they actually affect mitochondria. There's some grounds to think they do. There's some, the main literature says no, they affect these other things instead. So who's right? And is there anything in there to do with fields and electron spin or proton spin? Are we talking physics? Or are we talking molecular biology? I think that's a very interesting question. I think there's going to be a lot more physics in biology in the coming decades. And it's been something which most biologists have been suspicious of for a long time. And there's a gradual surge of the importance of physics in biology and physics at the level of larger scale structures, so fields and things like that. I think that's where the future lies for a lot of it, but maybe I'm just badly wrong. That's one of the exciting things about science is I have no idea if that's true or not. It's my own hunch that that's where it's going. That's also what I'm most interested in. So there's some element in there whereby I'm seeing what I want to see.
Yeah, it's exciting, and it's cool to see that there's more people trying to understand multiple fields as well instead of getting locked into one specific category. So that interdisciplinary approach is going to be really exciting, especially when using AI and large language models to help synthesize a lot of those fields' data and then maybe giving back feedback loops that help us think
Yes, I
differently.
mean, in some strange way, I'm behind the curve on large language models and things. So to some extent, I'm thinking, what are they not good at? What are they not going to discover?
Hmm.
Because that's where I need to be. And
Yeah.
what they're not so good at is seeing patterns beyond the data. If the data here suggests that the answer's not here, and the data there suggests the answer's not here, and both of them, if you put them together, you may say the answer's over there somewhere, but there's no data there. So I'm going to do some experiments. AI at the moment isn't very good at that kind of inference. Effectively, the creative human leap of the imagination that becomes a hypothesis. Maybe in a year's time it'll be great at that, but right now it's not good at that kind of thought process.
Yeah,
So,
I like that. Yep, cool. I have one last question. I've had you for a while.
right.
I don't want to hold you up. If you were going to die today and you wanted to share something with the world or speak to the world, it was the last time you could speak. Is there anything you'd want to share?
Have fun.
Have fun. I love that.
Have fun. I mean, I'm serious. Really, life's got to be worth living. And one of the most wonderful things for me is that I found things I care about, and I'm being paid to work on them, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it's hard to believe that can come true. And in some sense, the only way it's ever going to come true is if you have fun doing what you're doing, and then things happen that you never expected. So I suppose my advice to my former younger self or to my kids or something is more or less try and enjoy what you're doing, and who knows where. Don't worry about the future.
That's a beautiful message. Yeah. It's been amazing having you here. And it's nice to have someone like you try to communicate to the general audience like myself and others. So I'm sure people will love reading your books. So I'll link everybody to your stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.